on July 4th. Instead, be patriotic. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share the learning objectives with you. Okay, so here's our learning goals for today. Again, you'll see the unit learning goals, which have remained the same from Monday to today. And then the thing that's changed is today's learning goals. We have 3 of them today. First, I want you to be able to distinguish between pragmatic and evidential reasons for belief and grasp the distinction between pragmatic and evidential arguments for belief in God. So the second thing is kind of an application of the first thing. Second, I want you to be able to distinguish, articulate, and evaluate James's and Clifford's positions. Apparently, I don't use commas anymore, so there. And third, I want you to form a view on the following question. Can pragmatic arguments for belief, whether that's belief in God or belief in anything else, rationalize that belief? And then secondly, there's a second question, can they actually be effective? Can you actually believe for pragmatic reasons or on the basis of a pragmatic argument? So today, you might want to screenshot this if you're like on your laptop or something. You might want to screenshot the learning goals if you haven't written them down. I'll give you a second to do that, and I'll tell you why right now. Okay, so today, this is what your exit ticket is going to look like. So right at the end, again, in order to give you more of a chance to earn participation points, I'm going to ask you the following question right before you leave today. I'm going to ask that you refer to the learning goals, and then on the exit ticket, there's actually a picture of the learning goals, and that you tell me one thing that you did, one concrete thing you did in the large group meeting to accomplish one of those learning goals. It could be raising your hand and asking for clarification or contributing to one of the arguments, or it might be something else. Oh, I wrote down a question I had during the large group section, and then I asked it to Justin during my small group section. I wrote down this question to look up after the class, something like that. So some concrete thing you've done to meet one of the learning goals. You'll have access to those learning goals in the form itself, but it would help you, I think, to think about them as you go through class. So that's why I encouraged you to screenshot the learning goals. With that, let's begin today's lecture. Okay. So today we're talking about the difference between evidentialism and pragmatism. And in order to do that, we have to talk about the difference between evidence or evidential reasons to believe and pragmatic reasons to believe, non-evidential reasons to believe. Now, the easiest way I can think of to distinguish between these two views, evidentialism and pragmatism, is as follows. For the evidentialist, when believing, you should only consider the evidence. You shouldn't consider anything else. Just consider the evidence you have. If you find yourself thinking, man, I don't know what to believe about X, think about what evidence you have with respect to X, and then form your belief. That's all you're supposed to do. For the pragmatist, on the other hand, you can consider evidence. Of course you can consider evidence. It'd be crazy if the view was like, just believe whatever you want. That's a dumb view. So you can consider evidence, but you have to consider it in the context of all the reasons that you have to believe. All right, so how I represented that is just like this. Evidentialism claims that evidence is the only good reason to believe anything, and pragmatism is like evidentialism plus, right? Evidence is one good reason to believe something, but there are other reasons. There are other kinds of reasons. Okay, an example might help us distinguish between these two views, so consider the following. This is a pretty standard example in the ethics of belief literature. A woman starts suspecting that her husband is cheating on her. He's coming home late from work on a regular basis, and sometimes his stories about where he's been don't line up. He seems emotionally distant and acts somewhat strangely. Now he recognizes these things, he's aware of them, and so he says, look, I know how this looks, but look, just believe me, I'm not having an affair or anything, things are just crazy at work right now, I'm totally scatterbrained, I'm not cheating on you, just trust me. Okay, now our question is, what should the woman believe? According to the evidentialist, she should believe what the evidence supports, even though it could irreparably damage her relationship if she believes falsely that her husband is cheating on her. If that's what the evidence supports, that's what she ought to believe. And in such a case, it seems like she kind of has enough evidence, right? Consider if it wasn't her situation, right, but her friend's situation. Her friend came to her and said, look, all these things have been going on. My husband's coming late from work, he's acting strange. What would she believe in that case? Well, she'd say like, clearly, the evidence is, it's obvious what's going on, right? So according to the evidentialist, that's it. If there's evidence for it, you got to believe it. According to the pragmatist, on the other hand, she should believe what, on balance, she has most reason to believe. Surely evidence is going to come into play here, but it's not just the evidence that she should consider. For instance, trusting her husband, she might reason, would strengthen their relationship. And sure, maybe she's wrong. Maybe she's being gullible and overly credulous. Maybe he really is cheating. But the value of her relationship, a totally non-evidential factor, should play some role in helping her decide whether or not she should believe. So whether you're a pragmatist or an evidentialist depends on what you think counts as a legitimate reason to believe. Should we restrict such reasons to the domain of evidence, or might some non-evidential factors sometimes come into play and rationalize beliefs even when they're not based solely on the evidence? In today's reading, we have people defending each of these views, right? Two Williams, James and Clifford. William James is defending the pragmatic position, and he does so with respect to religious belief in particular. We can summarize these views as follows. So William James, the pragmatist, makes the following claim. He says, if religion be true, he was writing in old-timey fancy language, if religion be true, and the evidence for it is still insufficient, I do not wish to forfeit my sole chance in life of getting upon the winning side. So for James, if a question is genuine, we'll talk about this in a second, if it's live, forced, and momentous, the evidence is unclear or it doesn't clearly speak to one side or the other, it's perfectly rational for one to follow one's passion in belief formation. William Clifford, on the other hand, says this kind of grumpy thing: it's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe in anything upon insufficient evidence. Like a maximally general claim. He also says, if a man holding a belief which he was taught in childhood or persuaded of afterwards pushes away any doubts which arise in his mind, the life of that man is one long sin against mankind. Again, these guys are really intense. But let's talk a bit more about each of their positions. So with respect to pragmatism, William James doesn't think you can just believe anything you want on any grounds whatsoever in any case, right? He's not asserting like the exact opposite of William Clifford's, it's wrong everywhere, always, and for any person, etc. He thinks there are certain circumstances in which non-evidential factors can come into play or are appropriate. What are those factors? Okay, he says, when the question is genuine, it can be rational to consider extra evidential reasons in determining whether or not to believe. So what makes a question genuine? Well, first, he says, it's got to be live, right? It's got to be a live hypothesis. And we had a really good question about what makes a hypothesis live. So one of your classmates asked, William James speaks of a hypothesis as being either alive or dead. However, his definition of such hypotheses are spoken of in reference to our pre-existing knowledge. And a live hypothesis is one we can comprehend or have some awareness of, have some access to, and a dead hypothesis is one which we have no prior information about and thus can make no connections. When I first read these terms, still quoting, I assumed the definitions as an alive hypothesis, meaning one that was true or possibly true, and a dead hypothesis as one that had already been proven false. Okay, so this is a really good clarification. It's a good way of clarifying what it means for a hypothesis to be alive. In some sense, whether a hypothesis is live or dead is subjective. It's subjective to certain features of an agent's situation, right? We sometimes talk about possibility in the context of believing in an objective way. We say, look, if I flip this coin, there's a 50% chance, an objective 50% chance it's going to land on heads, and a 50% chance it's going to land on tails, right? So that's objective probability. We don't always know the objective probability of things. But sometimes what we mean when we say something is possible is we mean, for all I know, this particular hypothesis is possible, right? And that doesn't require or entail that the objective probability is actually whatever number we're assigning it. It just means, look, here are the things I know, and given those things, it seems like this hypothesis is possible, right? So when James speaks of a hypothesis being live, he's saying that it's live for a particular agent. And he gives an example in an extended version of the text that you read for today, where a hypothesis is live for someone and not live for someone else, right? He gives it in the context of religion. He says, look, consider the hypothesis that the Christian God exists. He says, to a Muslim who was born into a thoroughly Muslim culture, and maybe it was like a particularly insulated Muslim culture, where they never even encountered the idea that the God of Christianity exists. I quickly ran into a problem because maybe those gods are identical. But say they're not, right? Or say the Muslim is considering whether or not Jesus is the ordinary means of salvation or something like that. It might be that that hypothesis is just not at all live for that particular Muslim, because they have no background knowledge, no background information about this. Nothing in their experience suggests it to be true. It's just not even rationally accessible. It's not even a real live possibility for them. Whereas somebody who was raised in a pluralistic culture where there were all kinds of different religions and thus had access to Christians who told them about, theories of atonement and how they thought like Jesus was incarnated and all that, maybe that hypothesis is live for that person, right? So whether a hypothesis is live is going to depend on your background information, your background beliefs, what you already know, etc. And so in a sense, whether a hypothesis is live is the question. It's true. It is determined by whether or not it's possibly true given that background information, given those background beliefs. Okay, so much for a hypothesis being live. How about forced? There are some questions, William James says, that are forced and some that are not forced. For instance, the decision whether to bring my umbrella to school today depends on the answer to the question whether it's going to rain, right? And according to James, I can't just defer and remain agnostic about that question and still get any of the goods that I would get if I decided the question, right? So if I just look outside and I say, I don't know, there's evidence it's going to rain, there's evidence it's not going to rain, but I'm just going to remain agnostic. That's as bad as if I decided wrongly that it wasn't going to rain and didn't bring my umbrella, right? Because there's no chance that I'm going to gain any of the benefits I would gain if I answered the question. I have to answer it in order to act in a particular way. For James, the religious question, whether God exists, is forced because for James, agnosticism is in the same boat as atheism, right? He's thinking of it somewhat crudely, but he's thinking of it like this. If you remain agnostic, when you get to heaven, God's going to be like, sorry. If you're an atheist, when you get to heaven, God's going to be like, sorry. But if you're a theist, when you get to heaven, God's going to be like, welcome. Your room's over there, right? So for James, not deciding is the same it has the same practical consequences as deciding not to believe. So there's certain cases in which not deciding has the same practical consequences as deciding not to believe. And that's what it means for the question to be forced. And then, of course, there's this third condition. It's got to be momentous. It's got to be something that's really important. The stakes have to be somewhat high, right? If you had a forced live hypothesis or question, but the stakes were really low, like who cares, right? Believing the truth about whether there are an even number of stars, total number of stars in the universe, I guess it's a live hypothesis because like I can understand how it would be true or how it would be false. Yeah, okay, I know what it means. Is it forced? Well, you know, believing remaining agnostic, I guess, has the same results in some sense as believing that it's false or not forming a belief on the. But it doesn't matter at all. There's no practical stakes, right? It's not a momentous question. Nothing hangs on it for me. Okay, so those are the three conditions. If a question meets those three conditions, William James says it's a genuine question, and non-evidential factors might come into play in deciding whether or not to believe it. Our example of the potentially cheating spouse, that would count as a momentous, forced, live question, and thus genuine for James. He also gives another example, an example of a hiker who has to decide whether to believe he can jump over a particular chasm. And certainly, James thinks the religious question, whether God exists, is a genuine question. Okay, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have William Clifford. Clifford is a strict evidentialist. He claims that we have a moral obligation not to believe against the evidence in any case whatsoever, and he grounds this in sort of an argument from the common good. He thinks that unjustified beliefs that aren't totally supported by the evidence, are like a poison that gets into society and disintegrates the fabric of that society. People walk around with these false beliefs, and then other people start thinking, oh, well, that person believes that, maybe I should too, I don't know. And soon we just have falsity in our entire web of collective beliefs, and this is gonna have just lasting political and social implications, and he thinks this is just one of the worst things you can do. It's a sin against humanity. It's somewhat obvious in the cases that he offers that this claim is actually true, right? That we have a moral obligation not to believe against the evidence in the cases that he offers, right? So the ship owner case, he says, look, there's a ship owner who's thinking about sending a ship across the ocean. A bunch of people would be in it. And he doesn't have great evidence that it's going to make it, but he thinks like, yeah, he kind of talks himself into it. He's like, yeah, I'd really like to believe it. And it seems like very clear in that case, he's done something bad or wrong, right? The ship owner shouldn't have just believed that. The ship owner clearly should have gone out and gathered more evidence or gotten some people to like look at the ship and experts to testify, something like that. But remember, it's not just in any particular case that Clifford's position is going to be proven right. He's got to prove this with respect to every single belief, right? And he does. He addresses the genuine question of whether God exists. And so he does engage directly with William James. But just keep in mind how strong his position is. Okay. So now let's talk really quickly about a pragmatic argument for belief in the existence of God. And here's where Pascal comes in. Pascal wasn't a pragmatist himself. He existed long before pragmatism. But he gives us kind of a framework for thinking of a pragmatic argument. So basically, he gives you the following argument. You saw the video, so we'll go over this somewhat quickly. But he says, look, if God exists and you believe that God exists, then you're going to reap almost infinite reward. That's a really good thing, infinite reward. There's like no better rewards or better kind of reward. If God exists and you fail to believe that he exists, you'll be punished forever. That's a horrible thing. It's infinitely horrible. If he doesn't exist and you believe that he exists, you'll lose barely anything. And if God doesn't exist and you believe that he doesn't exist, you'll gain almost nothing. So here's the decision table that he writes up. And he concludes on the basis of this that you should believe that God exists. Even if there's not a ton of evidence, even if the evidence isn't overwhelming for this proposition, you should definitely believe that God exists because the rewards, the potential rewards are so great. The stakes are so high. Okay, so let's talk really quickly about a couple of problems with each of these views. We're going to fly through this. We can talk about it more in the large group discussion if you want. First, here are some unresolved questions or problems for pragmatists. One, how can we choose to believe on genuine questions when it doesn't seem like we have any control over our beliefs at all? This is the problem of doxastic involuntarism. So you might think, look, William James, look, Pascal, you've convinced me. I really ought to believe. It would be much better for me to believe than not believe. But I just don't have any direct control over my beliefs. I can't just decide to believe. A second problem arises when we think about the kinds of reasons that are legitimate to use in belief formation, right? We got to distinguish somehow between legitimate reasons for belief and illegitimate reasons for belief. Even the pragmatist is going to say, you can't just believe on the basis of wishful thinking. You can't just desire to believe and thus believe, even in on genuine questions. So how is it that we're going to distinguish between appropriate reasons to believe, especially appropriate non-evidential reasons to believe, and inappropriate reasons to believe? For the evidentialist, a bunch of questions arise. A lot of these are versions of questions you asked in the Google Doc. What for the evidentialist counts as sufficient evidence for belief? How high is the bar? If it's too high, then it seems like we should be agnostic about everything. And maybe we wouldn't be able to even leave the house because look, I don't have great evidence that there's not going to be some sort of natural disaster today. I don't have great evidence one way or another. So should I not believe that until I have good evidence? Well, then I should do a bunch of research. And so if the bar is too high, we're not going to be able to believe anything. If it's too low, we're going to be able to believe all kinds of things that we don't think we ought to believe. So the evidentialist owes us an explanation, or at least some sort of answer to the question, what counts as sufficient evidence? Similarly, it seems like there's times when the evidence is sufficient, but perfectly balanced. So maybe I have a ton of evidence for a proposition and a ton of evidence against the proposition. In those cases, if I believed the proposition, I would have tons of evidence. If I believed the negation or the opposite of the proposition, I'd have tons of evidence. So in those cases, can't we still will ourselves to believe? What would the evidentialists say about that? Finally, we have to know what the nature and scope of our moral obligations are with respect to belief. Clearly, we're going to want to get more specific than just believe only based on evidence. We're going to have to figure out how much evidence you need. We're going to have to figure out what our duties are with respect to evidence gathering. It can't just be the case that I can believe whatever the evidence I have tells me to believe on any given question, right? It's like, I just don't have a ton of evidence on certain questions. And yet we think you need answers to those particular questions. So we're going to have to say a lot more, or the evidentialist is going to have to say a lot more about the nature and scope of our moral obligations with respect to belief. All right, so finishing up then, related to all of these questions is the Collard piece that we read for today and that we also read at the very beginning of class. We're not going to debate it directly, but I just want to call your attention to it in the context of the questions that we've just raised. Perhaps it's rational to aspire to certain kinds of faith or trust, even when that goes beyond the evidence, and even if it's partly based on pragmatic reasons. That would, of course, entail that strict evidentialism is false. But how many of us believe that we ought to withhold belief completely and endorse a very strict kind of skepticism, even in cases where the benefits of belief are great and the drawbacks few? Throughout the remainder of class today, then, we're going to examine some of these issues in greater detail and try to sort out for ourselves whether we should be strict evidentialists or whether, with William James, we can sometimes consider pragmatic factors in the process of belief formation. Okay, so that ends the lecture for today.